Deep beneath the sands, south of Cairo, a team of archaeologists lowered themselves into a shaft that hadn't seen daylight in over 4,000 years. At the bottom, sealed with mortar exactly as it had been left in antiquity, sat a limestone sarcophagus weighing 45 tons. When the 5-ton lid was finally raised, one man looked inside and saw something no one expected to find intact after so many centuries: a body wrapped from head to foot in sheets of gold. This is the story of that mummy, the tomb that held him, and the small city of the dead surrounding him that is still, more than a century after Tutankhamun, giving up secrets. The discovery took place at Saqqara, one of the most important archaeological zones in all of Egypt. Saqqara sits within the boundaries of ancient Memphis, the first capital of a unified Egypt, and today the entire area is protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is not a single tomb or a single pyramid. It is a sprawling necropolis that has been in continuous use, on and off, for close to 5,000 years, containing more than a dozen pyramids, countless tombs of nobles and officials, animal burial grounds, and even later Coptic Christian monasteries built long after the pharaohs had vanished from power. At the heart of this landscape stands the Step Pyramid of Djoser, the oldest large-scale stone monument built by human hands, constructed around 2650 BCE by the architect Imhotep. It was near this pyramid, in an area known as Gizr el-Mudir, that the new discovery was made. Gizr el-Mudir itself is something of a mystery. It is a massive stone enclosure, older even than Djoser's pyramid complex, and archaeologists still don't fully agree on what it was originally built for. Some believe it may have been an early, unfinished attempt at a royal funerary enclosure that was later abandoned in favor of the step pyramid design. Whatever its original purpose, by the time of the 5th and 6th dynasties, roughly between 2500 and 2100 BCE, the area around it had become a burial ground for some of the kingdom's most powerful officials. The excavation that led to this discovery had actually been underway for about a year before the announcement. Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, the country's former minister of antiquities, and one of the most recognizable figures in Egyptology, led the mission. His team had been slowly uncovering a series of shafts cut straight down into the bedrock, some of them dozens of feet deep. One of these shafts descended roughly 15 meters, or about 50 feet, into the ground. At the bottom of it, the team found a room, and inside that room, the sarcophagus. What made this find so remarkable wasn't just its age. The vast majority of ancient Egyptian tombs that archaeologists uncover today have already been disturbed. Grave robbers have been active in Egypt since almost the moment burials began, drawn by the very treasures that Egyptian religious beliefs demanded be buried with the dead. Entire dynasties of tomb raiders operated within decades of a burial taking place, sometimes with the complicity of the very priests meant to guard it. Because of this, most tombs that archaeologists find are missing much of their original contents, if not completely emptied out. This sarcophagus was different. It had never been opened. The mortar seal placed on it by workers more than 4,000 years ago was still intact when the team found it. Inside, once the lid was lifted, they found the mummy of a man whose name was recorded in inscriptions carved into the sarcophagus itself, Hekashepes, and his body was completely wrapped in layers of gold leaf, hammered thin and applied directly over the linen wrappings that bound him. News outlets around the world quickly picked up the story, and some of the initial reporting overstated it, calling Hekashepes the oldest mummy ever discovered in Egypt. That claim is inaccurate, and Hawass himself later clarified the record. Mummification in Egypt stretches back much further than the Old Kingdom, with naturally preserved bodies from the pre-dynastic period, sometimes called ginger, in reference to one famous example held at the British Museum, dating back roughly 5,000 years, even before formal embalming techniques existed. What made Hekashepes significant wasn't that he was the oldest mummy in an absolute sense. It was that he represented the oldest complete, non-royal mummy ever found, still wrapped in gold, sealed inside an untouched sarcophagus from this specific period of Egyptian history. That distinction matters, because it means archaeologists were looking at a burial almost exactly as the people who performed it had left it, without the interference of looters, restorers, or previous excavators. That bureaucratic class turned out to be the real heart of this discovery, because Hekashepes wasn't found alone. Around his shaft, the excavation team uncovered several other tombs belonging to men who once held real positions of power in Old Kingdom Egypt. The largest and most elaborately decorated of these belonged to a man named Khnumjadef. His titles, carved into the walls of his tomb, describe him as an inspector of officials, a supervisor of nobles, and a priest serving in the pyramid complex of King Unas, the last ruler of the 5th dynasty. Unas reigned roughly 43 centuries ago, and his pyramid still stands at Saqqara today, notable for being the first to have its interior walls covered in the pyramid texts, a collection of spells meant to guide the king safely into the afterlife. Khnumjadef's tomb was singled out by the excavation team as one of the most important finds at the site, largely because of its exceptional decoration. Its walls are covered in scenes of everyday life, painted with colors that have remained vivid and well preserved across more than 4,000 years underground. Another tomb, similarly grand in scale, belonged to a man named Mary. Mary held a title that Hawass described as one of the most intriguing uncovered at the site, Keeper of the Secrets. This wasn't a figure of speech, it was a formal priestly title held by senior palace officials, and it came with real religious authority. Men who held this title were entrusted with performing sacred ceremonies considered too important or too dangerous in a spiritual sense to be witnessed by anyone outside a small circle of initiated priests. Mary also served as an assistant to the commander of the royal palace, placing him close to the center of power in the Old Kingdom court. His tomb was the second largest uncovered at the site after Khnumjadef's. A third tomb belonged to an unnamed priest who served in the pyramid complex of King Pepi the Mertz, a 6th dynasty pharaoh who ruled Egypt for several decades in the 24th century BCE. This tomb didn't yield inscriptions identifying its statues, but it did contain 9 remarkably detailed carved figures. Among them was a depiction of a man and his wife, with the wife holding onto her husband's leg in an affectionate pose, while their daughter stood nearby holding a goose, a common offering animal in Egyptian funerary art. Other statues in the group portrayed household servants, including one showing a woman in the act of baking bread, a small but vivid window into the domestic routines of ancient Egyptian daily life, carved in stone to accompany someone into eternity. The fourth tomb belonged to a judge and writer named Fetek, identified through inscriptions on his coffin. Fetek's tomb contained what the excavation team described as the largest statues found anywhere in the surrounding area, an unusual honor for someone who wasn't royalty, and a sign that scribes and legal officials could accumulate significant wealth and status in Old Kingdom society. Writing itself was a rare and valued skill in ancient Egypt. Only a small percentage of the population could read or write, and scribes occupied a respected position that could lead to real influence within the state bureaucracy. Fetek's oversized statues suggest he made full use of that position. In a separate shaft nearby, the team uncovered a cache of 14 wooden statues, dated broadly to the Old Kingdom period, sometimes called the Age of the Pyramids, spanning roughly from 2700 to 2200 BCE. Unlike the tombs of Khnumjadef, Mary, and Fetek, these statues carried no inscriptions identifying who they represented, leaving their exact origin a mystery the excavation team has yet to solve. Taken together, these tombs paint a detailed picture of a functioning, highly stratified society built around religious devotion, administrative order, and a firm belief that death was not an ending but a transition. Every object placed in these tombs, every painted scene of daily life, every carved statue of a servant baking bread or a wife embracing her husband existed for a practical spiritual purpose. Ancient Egyptians believed that the afterlife required the same things life did: food, servants, family, and a body capable of receiving the soul. The statues functioned as backup vessels in case the mummified body was damaged or destroyed. The painted scenes weren't decoration in the way we think of art today. They were functional magical insurance policies, believed to spring into 3-dimensional reality in the next world through ritual and inscription. Which brings us back to the gold. Why would an Old Kingdom official be wrapped in gold leaf in the first place? The answer lies in Egyptian religious belief about the nature of the gods themselves. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the gods as having skin made of gold, bones made of silver, and hair made of lapis lazuli. Gold, in particular, was associated with the sun god Ra and was considered eternal and incorruptible, a material that did not tarnish, rust, or decay the way other metals did. To an ancient Egyptian mind, that made gold the perfect substance to place on a body meant to become divine and immortal in the next life. Wrapping a mummy in gold wasn't about material wealth for its own sake, although wealth and status were certainly part of it. It was an attempt to physically transform the deceased into something closer to a god, someone whose flesh could withstand the endless span of eternity the same way the god's own body supposedly did. This belief didn't disappear with the Old Kingdom. It persisted for well over 1,000 years, reaching its most famous expression in the burial of a very different kind of figure, Tutankhamun, the boy king of the 18th dynasty, who ruled roughly 1,000 years after Hekashepes was laid to rest. When Howard Carter's team opened Tutankhamun's innermost coffin in 1925, they found the king's mummy fitted with gold caps on each individual finger and toe, and gold foil sandals on his feet, an echo of the exact same religious impulse that had led officials like Hekashepes to be wrapped in gold leaf centuries earlier. Tutankhamun's iconic burial mask itself, made from sheets of gold, alloyed with a small percentage of copper to increase its flexibility, represents the most elaborate expression of this same idea, a face made permanent and divine through precious metal. Seen side by side, These two burials, separated by roughly a millennium and an enormous gap in social rank, one an unremarkable official and one a pharaoh, reveal just how deeply and consistently this belief in gold as a pathway to eternity ran through Egyptian civilization. For archaeologists, sealed and untouched burials like Hekashepes's carry a value that goes well beyond the gold itself. Most of what we know about mummification comes from tombs that were already disturbed by the time modern excavators arrived, meaning researchers are often forced to reconstruct funerary practices from partial or displaced evidence. A sealed sarcophagus offers something closer to a controlled snapshot. Every layer of wrapping, every position of the limbs, every object placed inside the burial chamber remains exactly where ancient hands left it, giving researchers a far more reliable basis for understanding how burial rites were actually carried out in the 5th and 6th dynasties, rather than how they were carried out according to texts written for a very different audience, namely the gods themselves. Modern Egyptology has also become far more cautious about physically unwrapping mummies than it once was. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was common practice for archaeologists, and sometimes even paying spectators at public events, to unwrap mummies by hand in search of jewelry, amulets, and other grave goods. This process was often destructive, and countless artifacts and delicate organic materials were damaged or lost entirely in the process. Today, the standard approach favors non-invasive methods wherever possible. Researchers increasingly rely on CT scanning and X-ray imaging to study what lies beneath the wrappings of a mummy without disturbing a single layer of linen or gold leaf. This shift in method reflects a broader change in how the field approaches these remains, not simply as sources of treasure to be extracted, but as human beings and irreplaceable historical records that deserve to be studied with the same care that was originally taken to prepare them for eternity. The discovery of Hekashepes and the officials buried around him also says something meaningful about the timing of this find. It was announced in January 2023, just over a century after the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, a coincidence that Hawass himself pointed out during the announcement. More than 100 years after the discovery that made Egyptology a household topic worldwide, the sands of Saqqara were still producing sealed, untouched burials that had somehow escaped the attention of looters for over 4,000 years. It's a reminder that even after nearly 2 centuries of organized excavation in Egypt, the country's ancient landscape has not been fully mapped or fully understood. Saqqara itself remains a site of active, ongoing excavation. The area around Gisr el-Mudir and the Unas pyramid complex has continued to yield new tombs and artifacts in the years since 2023, part of a much larger, decades-long effort to document the full extent of the Memphis necropolis. Archaeologists working there have described it as a location that, despite more than a century and a half of formal exploration, still holds far more beneath its surface than has ever been brought to light. Every new shaft uncovered raises the possibility of another sealed chamber, another untouched sarcophagus, another official whose name and titles have been waiting patiently in the dark for someone to read them again. What makes the story of Hekashepes so compelling isn't spectacle for its own sake. It's the fact that a relatively obscure, non-royal man, someone history had otherwise completely forgotten, was preserved so completely and so carefully that scientists working over 4,000 years later could reconstruct his social standing, his burial practices, and even the specific religious beliefs that shaped how his body was treated after death. Every layer of gold leaf on his wrappings was a deliberate act, rooted in a coherent, deeply held worldview about what it took to survive death and become something eternal. In uncovering him, archaeologists didn't just find a mummy, they found a direct, unbroken thread connecting the beliefs of Old Kingdom Egypt to some of the most famous royal burials that came 1,000 years later. And to the enduring fascination this civilization continues to hold over the modern world. Somewhere beneath the sands of Saqqara, more shafts almost certainly remain unopened, more sealed chambers wait undisturbed, and more names like Hekashepes, Khnumjadef, Mary, and Fetek are still sitting in the dark, ready to be read for the first time in more than 4,000 years. Beyond the gold and the sealed sarcophagus itself, the discovery at Saqqara opens up a broader conversation about how selective ancient Egyptian gold burials actually were, and why that selectivity matters for understanding this civilization. Gold was never handed out casually to the dead. Egypt itself controlled significant gold sources, particularly in the eastern desert and in Nubia to the south, and expeditions to mine and transport that gold required organized labor, military protection, and administrative planning at the highest levels of the state. For an individual mummy to be wrapped in sheets of it meant that gold had been diverted, quite literally, from the treasury and channeled into a single burial. That diversion of resources tells us Hekashepes wasn't simply respected. He was valuable enough to the state, or to whoever oversaw his burial, that a portion of Egypt's most tightly controlled material wealth was permanently sealed underground with him rather than kept in circulation. This raises a question that Egyptologists still debate. who actually authorized burials like this one? Officials of Hekashepes' rank didn't have unlimited personal fortunes to spend on their own funerals. In many cases, the pharaoh himself, or the palace administration acting in his name, granted favored officials the right to specific burial goods, including gold, as a reward for loyal service. A lavish burial wasn't only a personal achievement, it was frequently a form of royal favor, a physical record of a relationship between a ruler and the men who kept his kingdom running. Seen this way, Hekashepes' gold wrapping may say as much about the pharaoh he served as it does about the man himself, though without a named ruler explicitly tied to his tomb, that connection remains inference rather than certainty. It's also worth putting this find in context alongside other metal-associated burials discovered across Egypt over the past 2 centuries, because gold-wrapped remains are exceptionally rare, not routine. The vast majority of mummies recovered from Old Kingdom and later periods show no trace of gold at all, either because they never had any to begin with, or because looters stripped it away within years or decades of burial. Gold's incorruptible reputation in the afterlife made it just as desirable to grave robbers in this life, and that tension defined much of Egypt's funerary history. Entire dynasties of pharaohs eventually moved their most valuable burials to secret, heavily guarded locations, specifically because sealed tombs advertising their contents through elaborate architecture became easy targets. Ramesses, the second's mummy, for example, was relocated in antiquity to protect it from robbers, and wasn't rediscovered until the 19th century, alongside a cache of other royal mummies moved for the same protective reason. Hekashepes' tomb avoided this fate not through relocation, but through sheer depth and concealment, buried at the bottom of a shaft that apparently escaped notice for over 4,000 years. The presence of Khnumjedef, Mary, and Fetek, buried in close proximity to Hekashepes, also suggests this section of Saqqara functioned as a kind of prestige cemetery for high-ranking officials connected to specific royal pyramid complexes, rather than a randomly chosen burial ground. Khnumjedef's link to Unas and the unnamed priest's link to Pepi the Fring show that officials often sought burial near the pyramid of the king they had served, physically tying their own eternal existence to that of their ruler. This practice reinforced the social hierarchy of the afterlife itself. Just as these men had served the pharaoh in life, their tombs positioned them to continue serving, or at least accompanying, that same pharaoh symbolically in death. None of this diminishes the significance of the gold itself, but it does reframe it. The wrapping wasn't a random flourish of wealth. It was the visible endpoint of a religious, political, and economic system working together, one where belief in divine incorruptibility, royal patronage, and the physical control of Egypt's gold supply all converged on a single, carefully sealed body at the bottom of a 50-foot shaft. Every detail the excavation team recorded, from the daily life scenes painted on Khnumjedef's walls to the goose held by Pepi's priest's daughter, adds another piece to a system of belief that treated death not as a void, but as a continuation requiring careful, deliberate preparation. That is ultimately what makes discoveries like this one so valuable to modern historians. They don't just add another artifact to a museum catalog, they confirm, correct, and deepen our understanding of exactly how a civilization that has fascinated the world for over 2 centuries actually thought about power, loyalty, wealth, and eternity, preserved not in written record alone, but in gold, stone, and the sealed silence of the Egyptian desert. If a story like this pulls you in, it's worth remembering that Saqqara is still being excavated right now, which means there's a real chance more sealed tombs like this one are waiting to be opened in the years ahead. Egypt hasn't run out of secrets, and neither has this channel. If you want to be here the moment the next tomb is opened, the next hidden chamber is found, or the next name lost for 4,000 years is finally read aloud again, make sure you're subscribed, because these discoveries don't wait for anyone, and neither should you. Take a second right now to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because ancient Egypt doesn't reveal its secrets on a predictable schedule. A find like Hekashepes and the officials buried around him can surface without warning, and if you're not subscribed, you might miss the story completely. Drop a comment below and let us know what surprised you most, whether it was the sealed sarcophagus that sat untouched for over 4,000 years, the idea that gold was believed to be the literal flesh of the gods, or the fact that men like Khnumjedef and Mary, virtually unknown to history until now, once held real power in one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. Your comments genuinely shape what we dig into next. So if there's a mummy, a tomb, or a mystery from ancient Egypt you want explained in full, tell us and we'll take it on. And if this video gave you even 5 minutes of genuine fascination, do us a favor and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. Every share helps this channel keep bringing these stories to light, and helps make sure that men like Hekashepes, buried and forgotten for over 4,000 years, are finally remembered the way they were meant to be. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. where the sand always seems to be hiding just one more secret.